up whenever. So let's talk a little bit about brain development. The American Academy of Pediatrics has their agenda for children that they update every year to kind of let us know where they're going as an organization. And right here in the middle is the early brain and child development strict priority. I'm privileged to be sitting on this group, the leadership work group at the Academy. We have a lot of wonderful things we're working on, but it shows you how much the Academy cares about this and thinks that this is really critical and important. And the principles I'm about to develop are really central to what we work on. So in 2007, the National Scientific Council of the Developing Child took all the stuff that we've done in neuroscience over the last, 3 decades really, that you look at this research and these MRIs and these scans and you say, oh, that's nice. What do I do with that? What do I tell patients? What do we do with that? And they tried to really pull it together into how you can affect policy. And we're going to go through some of their key points they made. So, number one, child development is a foundation for community and economic development. If you don't have capable children, you're not going to have a prosperous society. Okay, and this is something that's important for people outside of medicine and the sciences to understand. This actually makes a big difference to our society. Number two, brains are built over time. You can't put all your money into the first year of life and then say forget it. You can't put all your money into the 4th grade and then say forget it. You can't put all your money into 4-year-olds and say, okay, that's all we need. This is really the long view. Investment in the brain and its infrastructure has to happen along a long period of time. There's also the vice versa side of that. That what happens if a child has a very bad first 1 or 2 years? That doesn't automatically mean that they're going to amount to nothing. It actually may mean that they'll do just fine if they're given the right supports later on. So it works and cuts both ways. How many of you have heard of the biopsychosocial model of development? Yeah, okay, that's been around for a long time. I want to challenge you to add one more line to that, just because the longer it is, the better it is, right? The Eco-biodevelopmental model. There's this stuff that you spend too many hours looking at. There's health and development. But then there's the ecology, the physical and social environment. How does that affect health and biology and development and all those things? Your surroundings are just as critical as these other things. And really, if you look and try to predict developmental and health trajectories, there's really 3 things you should look at. One is the traditional genetic, prenatal, developmental factors. Stuff, again, that you spend a lot of time learning about. More and more, we're getting better at looking at the socioeconomic environment and saying, how does that affect things? What we don't look at enough is the microenvironment around the child. Okay? So, these attachment and relational patterns in their household, in their classroom, in their school, all those sorts of things. We rarely assess for that. When you go out and see what things are going on in the real world and, preceptors, etc., how often are people actually asking about this stuff? Often not. And this comes to the next principle, that it's the influence of genes and experience that actually shape the architecture of the developing brain. It's not all just genetically programmed, nor is it all just outside world type influences. All these things come together and make a critical difference. And what is the active ingredient? In pharmacology, we talk about the active ingredients. What is the active ingredient that makes a difference? It's this serve and return, like in tennis, relationship that the child has with others in their environment. I'm going to share with you a video. Relationships are important. I just said, here we go. Video. This gentleman is Edtronic. Well, this is a baby. This is an Edtronic. But Edtronic is the head of the child development unit at Children's Hospital in Boston. I worked for him as an undergraduate, and I coded the videotapes that he's about to talk about. I'll let him explain this face-to-face paradigm that he created.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Now we ask the mom to interact again.
I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes.
Aww.
Girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
The hard part is when you code these videotapes and the mom goes into the still face for 2 minutes and the baby doesn't do a darn thing because they're used to it. They're used to not being played with. They're used to their parent not being available for them. All right. Next is that simple circuits and skills are needed in order to do more complex stuff over time. This may seem really obvious, but I've had parents who say things to me like, "We do not talk in baby talk to our child. We only use complete sentences and proper grammar when interacting with our child." And I say, yeah, your baby's 2 months old. It's fine, really. You know, the child who goes ba, 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 ba is not just saying ba, ba, ba. They're developing those basic sounds that they need in order to be able to say more complex things. And we need to support those because they are meaningful. They're not just baby talk. This next one is really critical. Toxic stress in early childhood is associated with persistent effects on both the neuro and endocrine systems. And it can lead to lifelong problems if it goes on for a long time. Let's spend a little time on this. First of all, does physical health affect brain health? Yes, it does. This is 184 countries. This is a measure of disease burden. And this is IQ. Less disease, higher IQ. More disease, lower IQ. Now, you can argue about what IQ means and is it culturally biased and all that stuff. But still, there's clearly an association here. Now, these are CT scans. None of us need to be radiologists to say that these are both 2-year-old kids and that this is a normal one and this is a child who suffered extreme neglect. This is one of those Romanian orphans in the 1980s that like no one interacted with and all that stuff. So you can see the brain looks shrunken. It doesn't look as neuronally dense. The ventricles are larger. This does not look right. So you can imagine if we can see this grossly on a CT scan, what must be going on in the microarchitecture of the brain in cases of neglect and poverty and things like that. So when the stress response occurs, you release cortisol and epinephrine. Okay? Pretty easy. And this is a simplistic way of looking at the stress response. It's more nuanced than this, but you'll get my point here. There are 3 levels of a stress response when you're talking about this concept of toxic stress. One is what we call positive stress. When a stressor happens, we respond. We're supposed to. So your heart rate goes up, a little bit of cortisol, a little bit of epinephrine. This happens every time I give a talk. You know, I'm up here, because you don't want me falling asleep in front of you or like forgetting what to say or things like that. Slightly heightened awareness, etc. I mean, unfortunately, hopefully you don't have too many lectures from people who have no stress response and do fall asleep in front of you. I had one of those in med school, really. But then you have tolerable stress, which is a serious stressor, but it's buffered by supportive relationships. So if my slides blow up right now, and I have to do the rest of this talk from memory without my slides, and I go home and say to my wife, oh my God, it was terrible, they hated me. And my wife will say, there, dear, I'm sure it was fine. Okay, that was a serious, sweating bullets type response, but it was buffered by supportive relationships. But then you have toxic stress, where that stress keeps going on, never lets up, and there's few or no supportive relationships. Let me be very clear about this. Toxic stress is not a single or small group of bad, stressful events. It is not that. It is prolonged, unremitting stress that goes on over time that actually is part of your life on a routine basis with no way out and few supportive relationships. This is typically what we see in poverty. Because you don't see a way out of it, you have no idea how to cope, and you often don't have the social structures that go along with it. And in a sense, that socio-emotional buffering is the primary factor that makes a difference between toxic and tolerable stress. And this is actually the key intergenerational transmitter of health disparities. Because if you've never learned how to deal with this, you're not going to be able to model and show that to your child, and the cycle continues. Okay, so what are examples of positive stress in a child's life? They see someone showing up with their vaccines. They're anticipating a painful event, and the kid starts to cry. Okay, that's normal, though. We expect that. Parent leaves on the first day of preschool. Same thing. It's a sudden separation. What's going on? These are examples of positive stress. Tolerable stress can be big-ticket items. It can be a death of a family member. It can be serious illness. It can be a natural disaster. But if it's not going on over long periods of time, and if it's well supported, it's tolerable and does not have a significant, serious, toxic stress impact. But what if the situation's worse? What if there are no supportive relationships? So think about examples of that would be child abuse. That doesn't tend to be a one-time event. It's often a long-term event before it's discovered, if ever. Parental substance abuse, homelessness. Many of the folks we work with in Medic, these things don't just go away like this. People aren't homeless for a few days. They're not homeless for a few weeks. This is often a long-term issue. That is what we term toxic stress. And in January of 2012, the AAP released two statements, a policy statement and a clinical report on the effects of toxic stress. This is part of the AAP's official statements. So what happens? This is one of my two brain slides. We already went by the other one. So, the amygdala. The amygdala is the worry wart of the brain. And it enlarges in those who have toxic stress in their lives. We know this on MRI scan. The amygdala is larger, and there's more activity. Then you have the prefrontal cortex. Its job is to basically be your higher reasoning and to be your check to the amygdala, saying, hey, don't get so worried about things. It's okay. This is where you judge and think, your executive functioning, all that stuff. Well, there's less neural density and less function in those kids with toxic stress. And then finally, you have the hippocampus, major role in memory or mood. Hippocampal volumes are smaller on MRI in kids with significant toxic stressors. Again, physical changes you can actually visualize, and you get this impairment. So you get someone who always has a stress response. Their executive functioning and their thinking ahead and judgment has gone down, and they have problems with memory and problems with mood. What does that sound like? What's that? Depression could be one of them. ADHD or learning problems is the other one. I see a lot of kids who have simple ADHD. Little bit of medication, they do great. They're being well supported at home. Their grades skyrocket. Wonderful. Unfortunately, in my practice, that's the minority. I see a lot of kids, behavior problems, acting out, can't remember stuff, don't care after a while, don't think ahead. That's not plain vanilla ADHD. It's probably this stuff. And unfortunately, I don't have a good way to fix that. No one really does. We're working on it, but still, we don't have good ways. This is a true statement. Poverty is neurotoxic. Let me make the case to you for how I can believe that. 174-year-old children, they were enrolled in Head Start. They measured salivary cortisol so that they didn't have to keep sticking them. They probably appreciated that, keep their stress levels down. And they said, kids who had a typical cortisol response, where it went up with a stressor and then back down some period of time later, had higher executive functioning and were rated independently by the teachers as having better self-control. Those with abnormal responses, always high, always low, or this blunted response, had low levels of executive functioning and were rated independently as having poor self-regulation. So there's something going on here. There is a connection. Let's take this a step further. They took a study of 1,200 kids, and they looked to see how the mothers played with them. Those who did scaffolding, so the mom says, oh, yes, let me show you. You know those toys like the blocks with the shapes that go in the different shaped things, holes? Okay, oh, here's a square one. Look, it goes in the square one. And then the baby tries it. Scaffolding is demonstrating and then watching what the baby does and letting them take the lead, as opposed to authoritative, where you say, no, 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 you don't put the circle one in the square one. You know, it's like a very rule-bound sort of thing. Those who did scaffolding, those babies had lower cortisol levels and were more attentive. Those who did a more authoritative play style, which is more typical in lower socioeconomic classes, because that's what you're told in school. You always do things this way, and you don't deviate from that. Otherwise, you're wrong. You know, the right versus wrong thing. They had higher cortisol levels and were found to be less attentive. 7 months and 15 months, they found this across both those ages. And here's the kicker. Again, the more impoverished the family, the less likely they were to engage in scaffolding. So this pyramid shows you a few things. Early death is caused by disease, disability, and social problems. Okay, duh. Adoption of risky behaviors leads to those things. Duh. Probably some level of social, emotional, cognitive impairment leads to those risky behaviors, and adverse childhood experiences leads to that impairment. This is where the scientific gaps are. And the CDC said, we need to figure this out. We need to figure out this connection. How many of you have heard of the adverse childhood experiences study? Yeah, I was in Nebraska 2 weeks ago doing a talk on early brain development, and 3 people in this room, these are like all pediatricians, very smart people, 3 people raised their hand. So you're not alone in not hearing about this. This is the most important study you've probably never heard of. This doc in the mid-'80s, he was an internist doing obesity treatment, found that some of his best patients were dropping out. They were being successful. They were losing weight. They were doing everything right. And they were dropping out. And he couldn't figure this out. And then he noticed, hey, the folks who are dropping out have prior histories as children of traumatic events. He said, wow, there's something going on here. So he brought this up to the CDC, and they worked with Kaiser Permanente and looked at 17,000 patients retrospectively. Big, big study. Huge. And it was the first time they looked at simultaneously assessed different types of abuse and neglect and violence and all these sorts of things. Study participants. This is important. They were middle-class Americans from the San Diego area, largely white, largely college-educated, split evenly between men and women. Okay? This is not what you'd typically call a high-risk, impoverished population. Okay? This is a very everyday population. And then they looked at the different categories. Different types of abuse, neglect, domestic violence, some substance abuse in the household, mental illness in the household, parental separation or divorce, or someone in the home being incarcerated. These percentages are the prevalence. These are high numbers for a non-high-risk population. Look at that. 25% of them reported being physically abused as a child. Even the lower ones, 6%, had someone in their home go to prison. 6% is 1 out of 20 patients. If you're a busy clinician, that's 1 patient every day in your practice. These are unexpectedly high numbers. They gave a point for each of those categories. A third had none, but many had at least 1. And again, 4, 5, and 6, 1 out of 20 in each of those categories. So not only were these unexpectedly common, they also found their effects were cumulative. A lot of work has been done and is still being done looking and mining this data and saying what sorts of associations can we find. And I'm going to run through some quick graphs just to show you what they found. First of all, the more risk factors, the more the risk of childhood developmental delay. You have 5, 6, or 7 risk factors, you're virtually guaranteed to have developmental delay. Why do we care about developmental delay? Because it's expensive to care for. It's expensive to assess. It's expensive to treat. it takes a lot of time. That doesn't mean you don't do it, because it is so important, but it leads to a lot of resources being used. Okay, but then let's look upstream. Let's look upstream at adult disease. Look at the risk for adult cardiac disease. If you have 7 or 8 of these risk factors, your odds ratio goes skyrocketing. This is 50 years after these adverse events. This is not, I'm currently being domestically abused, or 10 years ago, I was battered. This is 50 years earlier. And this holds up for item after item. Smoking and COPD, strong association. Adult alcoholism, strong association. Depression, suicide, IV drug use. There's tons of papers coming out of this study that have really shown all these things. But we know that if we create the right conditions for early child development, it's cheaper and less costly than trying to fix it later. And it does pay you back. So if you have this idea of developmental progress going from birth to, age 6 or so, we have the kids that we call the healthy developers, whatever healthy means. You can quibble about that. Then you have the kids who we call high risk. These are actually kids that we can usually label pretty easily. The child who's born prematurely and has been in the neonatal intensive care unit for months and finally graduates, we know they're at high risk for developmental delay and lung problems and all sorts of things. You can easily put a label on them and get them services, usually. But then you have these kids in the middle that I worry about. There are many more of them, what we call at risk. Often they live in poverty. They're from minority groups that they have poor education status in the parents, all those sorts of things. So when you have adversity, what it does is it pushes down on all these curves. We don't want that to happen. We want them to progress the way they should be, or we want them all to progress along the green line, of course, and we want to do something to try to push these up. So we need to have good protective interventions that actually help prevent the effect of the adversity. So for the healthy kids, how do you keep them where they are? Anticipatory guidance. At the well child visits, talk about things. Put your baby to sleep on their back. Do these sorts of activities with your child. Read with your child. Do proper discipline, limit setting, timeouts, things like that. Make sure they have good health services. Put them in preschool. Preschool is not just a daycare. Preschool is not there so that the parents can go and work. Preschool is there to develop the brains of kids. With the kids who are at risk, remember the video, the face-to-face? You can train parents to be more responsive to their child. Sometimes just some short interventions can actually help. Stimulate them with language. Speak to them. We'll come back to that in a few moments. And do high-quality early childhood education. Does anyone here have kids? How do you find a good child care facility when you're new to town or you've just had a kid? Word of mouth often. But is there a way to figure out what's a good place and what isn't? Mm-hmm. They all should be licensed by the state. There's underground ones that we don't want to know about, but actually we do want to know about them. City of Madison has higher standards. Yeah. What if you don't live in Madison? Parent comes in and says to you, how do I know if a daycare center is good? There's a program called Youngstar. Pretty new in Wisconsin, about 2 years old. You can look up in a database. It tells you their rating from 1 to 5 stars. There's all sorts of criteria. There's financial incentives for them to move from 3 stars to 4 stars to 5 stars. They can have someone come and actually help them with that process and tell them what has to happen, things like that. Because we want early childhood education to be exactly that, early childhood education, not just child care, because it's important for these brains. And then for the really high-risk kids, home visiting, specialized services. Again, label, smaller number, means you can usually get these things figured out. In a sense, the world of pediatrics has changed. Yes, we still deal with a lot of infectious diseases, but my job, and I've actually liked thinking about it this way, is of developmental assurance. How do I get a child from 0 to 18, 21, whatever endpoint you want to put on pediatrics, with a healthy mind and a healthy body so that they can be productive adults? I will say, though, none of this is to say, I don't want people getting the wrong message here, none of this is to say that you should engage kids constantly. There's something good about solitary play, quiet time, reading on their own, all those sorts of things. That's perfectly okay. Number 2, bad things are not necessarily a long-term negative. That, if a couple of bad things happened, that's it. They're not going to amount to anything. And finally, that's not to say kids should not be appropriately disciplined. Limit setting and all those things are actually very important. I had a patient in clinic yesterday who is 10 and has virtually no limits set on her, and I'm really worried about what's going to happen in the next 5 years to her. Her mother just does not set any limits for a variety of complicated reasons, but it's not going to go good if things don't change. So if you remember nothing else about the early brain, here's 5 numbers to remember. At the height of brain development, 700 new neural connections per second. This is in infancy and toddlerhood. I still am stunned by this number every time I say it. I cannot imagine that they're wiring that quickly. We want the brain in the first 1,000 days of life, so it's 3 years, we want these to be optimal connections. This next one is really key. At 18 months, we can measure disparities in vocabulary. Let's pull up a graph here. 10 months of age to 36 months. This is receptive vocabulary, the child's ability to understand language from 0 to 1200, 3 different socioeconomic strata. Look what happens right here. You can already see a difference from the upper income kids. And before 24 months, you can see a difference between the lower 2. So Madison spent a few years arguing about whether we should have 4-year-old kindergarten. All these hearings and newspaper editorials and blah, 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 blah. 4 years is out here. Can you imagine the magnitude of these disparities out here? I'm sitting here saying, yeah, 4K, what about 3K, 2K, and 1K? A lot of these things are already set in place. Don't get me wrong, I think 4K is a great idea, but we need to be thinking earlier. And the problem is K through 12 educators, who by and large are very good at what they do, don't know what to do with kids under age 4. It's a completely different world. And they think early childhood is a 4-year-old. No, it isn't. Early childhood in my book is like 2 months. So my colleagues would argue early childhood is prenatal. We'll come back to this slide in a moment. Virtual certainty of developmental delay when kids experience 6 or 7 risk factors. Adult heart disease, we talked about that. $4 to $9 in returns, though, for every dollar you put into early childhood programs. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, said Frederick Douglass. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about reading. That study I just showed you comes from a large study done in the 70s and 80s, and they published the final results in 1995 by Risley and Hart. They went into everyday homes, and it wasn't videotape, it was actually film. They filmed what was going on, just everyday interactions. There was no intervention, just what is going on, and let's put these things together. So they did all that. What did they find out? A lot of stuff. Here's some of their data. By age 3, between the highest and lowest socioeconomic strata, big differences in receptive vocabulary, big differences in IQ. How many times did someone say something to the child in that household? Look at this, 178 times an hour. That's a lot of language directed at a child. But look what happens in the richer families. It's nearly 500 times an hour. And how many of those were encouraging things? A total of 75,000 by age 3. Nearly 500,000 in the richest families. And these were flipped for the discouragements, the negative comments. 200,000 versus 80,000. To put this another way, by age 4, there are 20 to 30 million fewer words that children are hearing. Remember that brain wiring stuff? 20 to 30 million fewer chances for their brains to wire well. So, in Wisconsin, how many kids 0 to 5 are read to on a daily basis? Well, nationally, it's just under half. We're about at that. We're at 46%, 38th out of the 50 states. Reading daily, this is not 2 hours of reading. This is like 10 minutes. Half of children in our country under age 5 are not being read to on a daily basis. Let's go to under 200% of the federal poverty line. Only 40% nationally, and only a third in Wisconsin. We're 49th out of 50 states. We do terrible when it comes to our poor in terms of daily reading. And here's the result. They show up at kindergarten, middle-income child, recognizes about 22 letters of the alphabet. Lower income, 9. You put them in class next to each other, and you ask them to do the same kind of work. Very rapidly, they start to stratify into different reading groups, etc. And this is not to say that they shouldn't. They need to get what's appropriate for them. But it's already there. This is what the teachers are dealing with on day one. Let's not blame them when kids are failing out. A lot of this is put into place beforehand. Not all of it. There's a lot that happens afterwards, and it needs to be well supported. But this is what they're starting with. 1/3 of children are failing kindergarten readiness tests. In Dane County, it's 41%. And of that 1/3, many will never catch up. This is 4th and 8th grade reading scores. Wisconsin is the black bars, purple, the nation. You can see we used to do pretty well, but we're not doing so great anymore. 8th grade, doing slightly better. Let's look at our African American population. We're terrible. We're way behind. So if you can't read well, you fail in school. Reading is the fundamental skill for being able to learn. And if you don't do well in school, you just don't show up. And you just flunk out completely. That leads to all sorts of issues. Delinquency, substance abuse, teenage pregnancy. And it all feeds back into poverty and dependency, and then the whole cycle comes back through. And this happens generation after generation after generation. It's hard to break these cycles. And you can't wait for school intervention. Because guess what? After a certain point, the kid just says, I can't do it. My wife once volunteered in my kids' class when they were in 1st grade, and she was asked to do some extra reading work with some of these kids. They had those lists of 100 words they need to be able to recognize and something like that. My kids and most of their peers, no problem, straight through. The kids who are struggling, they get through 3, 4, 5, maybe 9 words tops, and then they say, I can't do it. We destroy that innate curiosity kids have when they fail and struggle because they're not coming with the resources they need on the first day of school. Unless you think this doesn't really have implications down the road, other people have figured it out. Children's Defense Fund report from 2007, they spoke to a Mississippi state senator who used to be their deputy corrections secretary, commissioner of corrections. And they needed to know, what's our prison population going to look like in 10 years? So we can build and staff and budget and all that stuff. They hired a group in Washington that did the study. The third factor, the key factor, his words, not mine, were the reading and math scores in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. When our country is using elementary school achievement scores to figure out what the prison population is going to be in 10 years, you know something is really, really wrong. This is really sad that this held up and is true. So again, why reading? Reading is the fundamental skill for learning. Now, when a child is aware of books, not reading, but aware of books, there's a few things that come with that. One is this idea that printed words mean something. This is obvious to everyone in the room because you've been doing it for so long. But to the average child who's 2, who's used to being read to, they think that you, the reader, is telling the story the same way every single time just by looking at the pictures. Wow, isn't that great? But the average 3-year-old who's been read to knows there's something about these funny black marks on the bottom of the page and what you're saying. And I remember when my daughter was 2 and my son was 3, I had them both in my lap, and my daughter's just listening away, and I turned the page and I had my thumb over some of the words here because I was reading the other page. And I remember my son reaching down and shoving my thumb out of the way. I said, oh, he's developing print awareness. And one of the reasons that this is one of the greatest pieces of literature for children, what's on the last page? No pictures. And it was still hot with a completely blank page. But you read it in the same voice that you did everything else. And the child who sees just those little black marks and hears you saying that, this practically picks them up and hurls them headlong into the world of print awareness. That these mystery things have meaning to them. Background strategies and knowledge to obtain meaning from print. The wild things roared their terrible roars and showed their terrible claws and rolled their terrible eyes and what their terrible teeth. Gnashed their terrible teeth. Now, I don't use the word gnash in everyday conversation, but a child figures that gnashing is something scary done with the teeth. And they can just accept that and go on. And it's not a bad working definition. They can accept that and go on instead of having to stop you and say, wait, what does that word mean? Or worse, not ask what it means, but still be perseverating on that 3 pages later and have completely forgotten about the flow of the story. So being able to develop that is important. I think it's really important for you guys. I mean, look at all the words we throw at you that you have no idea what they mean. I still do that with ophthalmology reports. I can't understand what they're talking about. I'm like, yeah, return to clinic in 6 months. That I understood. I don't know what all these other words mean. Yeah. And then finally, fluent reading, that you're able to decode meaning very quickly without sitting here going, books, and then get meaning from it. So in the Great Green Room, there was a picture of a cow jumping over the moon. Very good. So you've either read this book, Goodnight Moon, 12.8 million times, or you know the nursery rhyme, or you picked it up from the picture there. All of these are equally valid strategies, and an 18-month-old who's had this book read to them should be able to do that completion. But it's not easy to read. Reading is something that our brain is not hardwired for. People say that when we scan text, we're actually repurposing circuits we used to use for hunter-gatherer type things, looking for food or animals or whatever. So it's hard to kind of bring that onto the brain. And we're asking kids to do a lot by the time they're 5 or 6. But this idea that print conveys information is what emergent literacy is all about. And the kid who scribbles or makes up stories by looking at pictures and things like that, these are those simple building blocks that matter. Just to highlight this concept of print awareness, for many of you in the room, this is a meaningless squiggle. You may recognize it and say, this looks like Chinese, and it is Chinese. But again, you may not know what it means. But if I break it down and tell you that this means king, this means state or kingdom, and this means center or middle, you get the phrase Middle Kingdom, which is actually the name that the Chinese have for their own country. That is Zhongguo, which is China. And now, all of a sudden, this has meanings, associations, memories, whatever, that goes along with it. That is the movement into print awareness that happens to children when they figure that out. And then there's the art of dialogic reading. This is really important for the families that you'll work with in poverty. How do you engage a young child? Young children are squirmy. They have a very short attention span, and they will not sit and be read to. And for parents who think that to be read to is to sit quietly with your hands folded and listen to the story, they will interpret this as the kid doesn't like to read. But what you need to do instead is give them permission to deviate. Talk about the pictures. Make up a story. Let the kid flip the pages. Whatever. It's absolutely okay. This isn't school where you have to have an assignment that is completed. That changes as the child gets older. But I get many parents who tell me with their toddlers, he used to like being read to, but he doesn't like it anymore. Inevitably, it's because they're trying to read exactly what's there. And the kid, again, has an attention span of 0.7 seconds, which is normal when they're a toddler. Remember, again, that it may not be a natural skill for adults. We need to give them this idea of dialogic reading and maybe model it for them. They themselves may not be able to read well. And they're more likely to tell you that than they are to tell their own healthcare provider that. And this can be an intergenerational problem. And of course, the stories are important to teach kids about bravery and kindness and sharing and all those lovely things. But really, reading should be fun. We're not trying to teach a child to read early. I'm not impressed by the 2-year-old who's like lugging around a copy of Harry Potter or whatever, So. All right, so now, Reach Out and Read. Reach Out and Read is a wonderful program. It's based out of healthcare providers' offices and clinics. It is not a hospital-based program. It's not a community-based program in the classic way. Very simple mission statement. We prepare our youngest children to succeed in school by partnering with healthcare providers to prescribe books and encourage families to read together. 3 parts to the model. This is the key right here. This is what makes us different from everyone else. Healthcare providers who've been trained, much like you're being trained now, encourage parents to read aloud to their young children and offer age-appropriate tips. And the way I summarize this in one picture is this, the prescription to read. I've handed this out. This actually prints on my Epic after-visit summaries in the clinic. I've handed these out in the state capitol. I've handed these out in D.C. when we do legislative visits for Reach Out and Read. People get it. Yes, partly it's a visual prop, they'll go around and show it to other people in their office. But they remember me. I come back the next year. You're the guy with the reading prescriptions. Yes. And in case you're wondering, yes, the license plate on my car says RX Read. So, yeah. But this tells people, though, this is as important as any other prescription I give you. This is as important as that amoxicillin. This is as important as me telling you to put your child in a car seat and bike helmets and back to sleep and don't smoke around them and eat right and all that stuff. This is how important it is. This isn't just one nice public relations thing. This is really critical, and that's why I bothered to put it on a prescription. And yes, there's a plug for public libraries there, too. Number 2, you give them the book, and the book goes home with them. It's theirs to keep. The book is for the child. Don't give it to the parent. Don't give it to anyone else. I give it directly to the child. I walk in with the book. You give it to them at the beginning of the encounter. This is not book as sticker, because you want to see what the child does with it. If they're 18 months or older, I give them the book upside down on purpose, because they might not be reading, but they realize something doesn't look right about this, and then I can watch them turn it. Or so I hope. Okay? The 3-year-old who runs up to you and says, "Oh, if you give a mouse a cookie, oh, I love this book," and starts flipping through the pages. Let's see. They ran up to me. That's gross motor skills. I heard language, memory, vision, turning pages, fine motor skills. I've done most of my developmental assessment in 6 seconds. If you want to read that annoying list of how many blocks is your child stacking on one, I don't know. I don't care. Okay? This is natural. It's organic. And then you can start asking, oh, do you have a chance to share books together every day? Oh, that's wonderful. This is so important for them. It's a great thing to do as a family. And then you can comment, look at how much he's loving the book. I love these books, the Baby Faces board books, because babies gravitate towards faces. And when they see this, they light up. I had a mom with a 6-month-old at Salvation Army Medic one night, and I said, oh, look at that. Look at how much he's loving looking at that book. And she looked down at her baby with a stunned look on her face and said, my baby's smart. Okay, she's living in a shelter. This gave her a moment of hope. That just made the whole program worth it right then, just to see that. And by the way, board books. Anyone here with an engineering background? No, not quite. This is a great piece of engineering. They're tough. Babies can throw them. They can mouth them. They can do all sorts of things. And look at the size of the page. They're designed for people who don't yet have a pincer grasp. They're designed for kids who have a palmar grasp. You can bat at it. There's a lot of thought that goes into these things. So, the book is theirs. It's theirs to keep. They take it home. And then finally, literacy-rich waiting rooms. Certainly at Salvation Army, we have people reading with them beforehand, which is a wonderful thing, great way to interact with kids, and to show parents that their kids can sit still and to demonstrate these dialogic reading techniques. Again, we're not trying to teach them to read early. Why should we do this through healthcare? Because 90% of kids under 3-year-olds come in at least once a year for a checkup. Only a third or less in poorer families go to child care. They're being cared for at home, relatives, neighbors, all sorts of things. So if we want to reach everyone, this is the best way to do it. Is there evidence? You bet there's evidence. There's 15 studies published in peer-reviewed journals, improved language scores, improved home literacy environment, all sorts of things. There is more evidence for the Reach Out and Read model than there is for any psychosocial intervention in general pediatrics. I am going to skip this next study for time. Basically, it says read together every day and put your kids to bed at the same time. Those are the 2 behaviors that make a difference, and they're inexpensive and cheap. Okay, so here's the basic thing. Tell parents, name pictures for the infant. Ask a toddler, what's that? And see if they can start to name it. The 3-year-old, ask them to identify colors. 4 or 5-year-olds, ask them what happens next in this picture. Ask them to pick out a few letters. I love when the 5-year-olds come in. They're going to start kindergarten. I ask them, what's that letter there? And you'll be surprised how many letters they can name. Or if not, say to the parent, great, why don't you work with him on a few letters at home? That'll really help him in the next 2 months before he starts kindergarten. Great way to do that assessment. I want to show you a brief video. This is an example of a Reach Out and Read interaction. Skilled provider. This is not scripted, real parent, real baby, all that stuff. They all look a little nervous because this camera is right there. But it gives you an idea for the flavor of what goes on.
Hello, how are you guys?
Okay.
Oh, you're okay. Can you say okay? I think you're learning a lot. Here's a book for you. Yeah. You might remember that we like to give books out at all of our well visits because we think it's important for kids to love to read. This, that. Yeah, what do you see? Do you like to read?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we just love that the kids get the books early. We hope that you like to read with her. I don't know if there are any times of day that you might spend with her looking at a book or on the weekends.
It's mainly on the weekends that I read to her, but her mother reads to her every night.
Right.
All the girls.
And she's also with Grandma sometimes, too.
Yes, and she reads with
Oops, sorry.
her throughout the day.
Great. So, Dad, when she was littler, she would put everything in her mouth. You might remember we were talking about that. Now that she's older, she probably won't do it that often. She'll do it a little bit less. But every once in a while, she's still exploring using her mouth and all of her new teeth.
Yes.
And she's still going to test things. You might see that she, is doing so much better using her fingers to open the book. And she'll also be asking you to read the book. And where before she might just look at it, if she likes the book that you have or she's interested in something in it, like a cat or an animal that she sees, she might be sort of getting your attention by hitting the book. But she's just really doing great with loving that book.
Yes. It's difficult where I don't read to the girls as much as the mother. I'm working, but I know she does use that as the calming tool just before bed.
Right.
That's when the 2 or 3 books, each one of the girls pick out a book, and then we'll read them all. Sometimes I stay in the bed for the story too, so we all get in the same bed, we listen to the story, then we put them to bed. But it's definitely a calming tool that we use.
Yeah, but we love that because they're learning from you how wonderful it is to be together, to be together as a family, or even just you and Nyla, and reading the books together is a really nice activity. It's different from everything else that you might do to be with them. Nyla, do you want to read the book? Yeah, show Daddy the book. You're tricky. Yeah, go ahead.
Nah. Hello, little mouse. What are you doing? You see the mouse? That's the mouse. Oh, I see. Are you going to pick that red, ripe strawberry? The big hungry bear can smell a red, ripe strawberry a mile away. You don't like this book? Huh?
No, actually, she does like this book. She's exploring it more. She's doing what I would expect a 1-year-old to do. If she was 2 or 3, she might be a little bit more interested in the next step of the story, the next part of what you're telling her. Mm-hmm. You're going to notice that she's going to start pointing to things and that you can point to things. The kids are really, really in the phase now where they're learning a lot of...
Okay, that's the end there. All right, so what did we learn from that interaction? What did we learn about their family life? Yeah. Dad's busy, he works a lot, but when he's home, they're all getting into bed together and reading. Great. Wonderful. His wife, Nyla's mom, is doing a lot of reading with the kids. They find it's useful as a calming tool. What did we observe? You notice how she grabbed the book? She loved it, yes? Yeah. Yeah. He was doing such a great job with her, but you wanted to make sure that he didn't get discouraged by that. And that, yes, she has a short attention span. There was that moment of joint attention where they're both looking at the book together. I mean, this is a lovely interaction. There was so much there. She calmed and tuned beautifully. He did dialogic reading when he said, "You see the mouse? There's the mouse." He did a great job, and she did a great job in interacting. Many reach out and read sites around the country, all 50 states, 5,000 sites, 6.5 million books a year, largest single purchaser of children's books in the country. Just a little bit about Wisconsin. December of 2010, about 50 sites in the country. We started our statewide coalition, Reach Out and Read Wisconsin, of which I'm the medical director of, and we've moved up now to nearly 80. And this is without doing a lot of advertising. It's a program of the Children's Health Alliance of Wisconsin. And I'm going to skip through this here because of time. If anyone wants me to come talk more specifically about children's books or screen time, I can always come back. Here's what I tell parents: read together daily. Give some reading time to your kids when they are starting to read, and let them read before bed for a few minutes. Get them a bedside lamp. Limit screen time to less than 2 hours a day. No screen time for kids under 2. I have a whole talk on that. No screens in the bedroom. Audiobooks are fine. Use your libraries. And the things to remember about Read, Shout, and Read, overall, parents and families love it. It's with them, not just about them. It's very easy advice for them to follow. We love it. It's efficient. Me walking into a young child's checkup without a book in hand is like me walking in without a stethoscope. I feel like I'm not getting the information that I should be getting. Clinic staff love it. They all have a role in it. These books, we buy them in bulk. They're $3 to $5 a piece. What else in medicine costs so little? Almost nothing. Fluoride varnish is cheaper. That's the only thing I can think of. 24 languages for the books. We have the evidence. All these things add up and come together. I'm going to skip the last video here and just leave you with this quote. While schools can do much to raise achievement among children who initially lag behind their peers, all too often preschool gaps set in train a pattern of ever-increasing inequality during school years and beyond. Any drive to improve social mobility must begin with an effective strategy to nurture the fledgling talent in young children, so often lost before it has had a chance to flourish. And I always end with this picture, my wife reading to my son. This caught them in this lovely moment of being lost in a book together, which is really what we're trying to achieve. So, we're just past the hour. I have time for a couple of questions if there are any.